Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thinking Beyond the Homelessness Sector session. My name is Emma Amon. I'm the Senior Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and I will be moderating the presentations in this session. Can you all hear me okay? Thumbs up? All right. Now, before we get started, it's important that we take the time to acknowledge the land that we are on. Everyone who is at the conference today in person is currently in Toronto. So that's where this land acknowledgement will be centered. But I recognize that this is partially an online event, and we have folks joining us from many locations. So as I'm reading the land acknowledgement for the Toronto area, I do encourage everyone else who is online to take a moment to acknowledge the land that they are joining us here from today. So let's get started with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land that we are meeting on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Just a couple more housekeeping notes before we get started. First off, a reminder to all virtual participants that you can submit questions in the question and answer tab below the live stream. Your question will be asked on your behalf during the discussion period. I should also mention that this session is being recorded for on-demand playback, so it's important that everybody speaks into a microphone when they are speaking. So if you're asking a question in the audience, please use the microphone. I will now introduce our first presenter. He's filling in for James Hughes. I'm happy to welcome George Ohana. So he is the head of homelessness prevention and research at the Old Brewery Mission. A big round of applause for George.
Bonjour tout le monde. A special bonjour to the people from Quebec. So I'm not James. So within the course of the last 8 to 12 hours, I got an email saying that he was not able to come because he had COVID. So I took a deep breath and I said, okay, so no problem. I'll do my best. And then within the last 20 minutes, I was told that the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, was not set up. So fortunately, this is a perfect storm for me. I don't have the knowledge of a CEO, but I have energy and the willingness to give as much as I can this morning. I have a copy of the presentation that I had made yesterday at the business center, so I'm happy to be able to read through it and answer questions at the end of the presentation. The second piece is I want to recognize also the work from the coordinator for the QHPPC, Emily Knox, that prepared the PowerPoint. So anyone that would be interested in getting a copy of the presentation, they can come and see me at the end of the presentation. I'll be very happy to take your emails and send you the presentation. Voilà. So I'll go, it won't switch from French to English, but sometimes I might because of being too bilingual sometimes in Montreal, which gives a special flavor to some of the presentations I make. So the Old Brewery Mission is located on the Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. It's situated on unceded traditional territory of the Kanesatake Nation. They are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters that have long served as a site of meeting and exchange for many First Nations. We acknowledge and give thanks to the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence continues to mark the territory. So the topic of today's presentation is homelessness in Quebec and thinking beyond the homelessness sector. We are looking at a paradigm shift, and we will take as an example the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative, the QHPPC, which tends to look at developing an intersectoral model for homelessness prevention. So connecting policy from frontline services to policy and vice versa. So this is quite unique in the sense that we're trying to merge synthesize, fusion elements that we see in community, but also in terms of policy. And you'll see through the presentation, hopefully, this sense of trying to merge and coalesce in terms of one unit. So the Aubry mission, for people that already know, is pretty well known in Quebec, known in Canada, but also known in North America. We are one of the oldest missions in Canada. We've been in service for over 130 years. We offer emergency services, physical and mental health programs, over 350 housing units, psychosocial support, research, and very, very recently, prevention services. So I was asked as the head of social housing to move from social housing to work on prevention. So it's almost a new world after working close to 15 years in social housing. So for the Aubry mission, this is a radical new way of thinking homelessness. It is almost, for me as a personal experience, almost diametrically opposed to what I was doing for the first 15 years. In what sense? It's very easy. You're meeting people that are not homeless, but are on the verge of becoming homeless. And how do you work ce qu'on appelle point de bascule, the moment when they drop into homelessness, and what can be done? So maybe 3 dates that I'd like to put in perspective in terms of Quebec homelessness. So 2015 was the first point in time count. We were looking at 3,016 individuals experiencing visible homelessness in the city. By 2018, another point in count where we were looking at 3,149 individuals, but on a provincial level, close to 5,789 individuals. So there is an increase, and we are talking about visible. What is invisible is still something that we're not able to calculate. There was, over the course of the last 6 weeks, a point in count, and by January of next year or February, we should be able to look at these new numbers. One thing is very clear, is that we have seen a huge increase in the number of homeless individuals in the city of Montreal, but also in Quebec. So despite the best efforts of community organizations in our sector who are working collaboratively, we are seeing a rise in people seeking our services due to 3 different factors. It's important to say that when you look at the number of organizations, community organizations in the province of Quebec, we are talking over 150 organizations that have the know-how, that have experience, and that know what they're doing, and we are still seeing an increase in numbers. So 3 different elements that we've touched upon over the course of this morning's plenary. The impact of COVID, the massive loss of affordable and deeply affordable housing, and the incongruence between rents and income. So Montreal, as most Canadians know, was for a very long time shielded from this sense of increase. We had a very good rental, healthy rental, but over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, numbers are starting to dwindle in terms of affordable housing at a very, very rapid rate. So after Vancouver, after Toronto, Montreal is getting the big hit. So in terms of thinking beyond the homelessness sector, we have introduced James Hughes, but also Eric Latimer, that is going to be here. He's going to talk as a co-chair. They created a partnership called the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative, the QHPPC, which is a joint partnership between McGill University's Department of Equity, Ethics and Policy and the Aubry mission, which is quite unique, having a great community organizations working with university to be able to build this kind of collective. It is its first kind in the province. So again, we're coming back to the idea of what the paradigm shift and what it means. So homelessness, as everybody knows, is a societal issue that extends beyond the homelessness sector. In terms of intersectoral model, led equally by community leaders and university researchers. So again, this sense of being able to work together to operate at a policy level and to elevate the homelessness prevention at a critical policy concern. So again, this sense of being on the same playing field, researchers, community organizations, experts being able to talk the same language and being able to build to meet the needs of policy makers. So mobilize and create knowledge across sectors to develop policy options. So by combining the respective strengths and knowledge of members across sectors to deliver policy options to provincial decision makers that will result in significantly fewer people entering homelessness in the first place. That's the objective of the QHPPC. The target, provincial decision makers. What kind of changes? We're looking at proposals for the adoptions of new laws, regulations, policies, programs, budgets, or amendments to existing ones. So the QHPPC focuses on primary prevention policies that target people and groups at risk of homelessness. Actions and policies may operate at 3 levels. I don't have the slide, so it's less interesting, but we have 3 different kinds of levels. The systemic one, the structural, and the individual one. So on a systemic level, if you read the framework created by Stephen Getz and Aaron Dej, I think these concepts come back regularly, but we are working with this frame and the lexicon that was used in 2017 by Stephen Getz and Aaron Dej. So systemic meaning creating housing services for people who are leaving correctional services, amongst other things, whether mental health, whether asylum seekers. So there are different elements that are linked to systemic. In terms of structural, increasing the amount and or accessibility of housing allowances. And the third one is completely blacked out because this is black and white. So it's individual. So how to work in terms of crisis and being able to bring change in terms of moving individuals out of crisis situations. So building a community of the QHPPC is not something that is easy, but at the same time, there's a lot of willingness. Over 40 members as of today from academic institutions, community groups, and the public sector, unifying strengths and skills across sectors. We have presently 5 working groups with experts, with researchers, with community level experts that are able to address some of the issues relative to preventions. These 5 groups are youth, immigrants and refugees, women experiencing intimate partner violence, people with justice involvement, and people living with certain mental health conditions. So these 5 groups are able to sit, discuss, and create policy briefs and bring those to the attentions of the QHPPC with the help on a more transversal relationship with the QHPPC and the other working groups to be able to bring this about on a provincial level. Some of the major accomplishments over the first year of the QHPPC, there was an inaugural conference on homelessness prevention in February of 2022 during the COVID, and it was a success with over 175 people participating. The gender research stream produced a first consultation paper investigating the intersection of intimate partner violence and homelessness. So this is a human rights-based approach, identified opportunities for law reform, and launch of this gender research stream is happening over the course of the next 60 to 90 days, which is a major accomplishment. Developed a foundation of prevention-focused research and policy proposals. So some of the things that we are looking to over the course of the next 12 months. Justice and Corrections Research Stream will release a report identifying factors that can contribute to homelessness for people with criminal justice involvement and opportunities for provincial policy reform. So analysis and recommendations include the expertise of participation of people with lived experience. So you have the YMCA in Montreal that have worked for many, many years in terms of working with les sorties carcérales planifiées, which meaning the individuals that are coming out of prisons, provincial detention centers, but at the same time being able to work with the justice system, to work with the prison system, to be able to have a better sense of what's going up upstream and how we can work together in terms of housing. So the full continuum. Drafting also a Quebec Homelessness Prevention Act in partnership with the Mobile Legal Clinic. And we are expecting by 2023, by May, or I think it's May, the annual conference, which is already called Preventing Homelessness, Evidence to Policy. We are also looking at adding 2 other streams to the 5 that I spoke about. One in terms of affordable housing, and the one in terms of indigenous-led strategies for homelessness prevention. In 2021, OBM, the Old Mission, created a Department of Prevention Services. So that's me. So I was asked in October of last year to create from scratch a new way of thinking prevention to homelessness. So we have, again, looked at systemic, early interventions, and eviction prevention. So we have created this sense of, again, through this fusion approach, to be able to have on one side this sense of what can be done on the ground, and on the other side to be able to think about what's to become prevention in Quebec. So we've already created a project or a few projects with asylum seekers, with the YMCA in terms of being able to build a relationship with recently released prisoners. We are also working with different individuals that are associated with l'Office municipal d'habitation de Montréal in terms of when they lose or are evicted, whether pre or post-eviction, what can be done in terms of their relationship to homelessness. So these are different elements that we are working on, and we're seeing results, very small results, to be quite honest, over the course of the last year to create these collaborations. It means maybe we've touched 30 to 40 individuals, which is not a lot, but this is the first year, and hopefully we'll be able to grow. The increase of homelessness in Quebec, this is the takeaway, and across Canada, highlights the need to work across sectors to develop effective preventive strategies by connecting policy to frontline workers and vice versa. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Have a great seminar.
Do you have a USB?
I do.
Okay, so if you give the USB to the gentleman at the back.
Jonathan, like at the back. Yeah, the person over there.
IT guy.
With the raised hand. Great. Well. It's interesting stuff.
Thank you for your amazing presentation, George. Now it's time to move on to our next presentation by Eric Latimer. Eric is a health economist whose work has spanned evidence-based practices for people with severe mental illness and for people experiencing homelessness. He was the lead investigator for the Montreal site and the lead economist nationally at the At-Home Chez Soi project. He led the analysis of the point-in-time counts in Montreal in 2015 and the province of Quebec in 2018. Currently, he is the co-chair of the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative. Off to you, Eric.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I first want to compliment Georges. I was just amazed at kind of the quality of his presentation, considering it was only 36 hours ago we were advised that James Hughes had COVID, and he had to fill in. Great job, Georges. So I'll try to do approximately as well. So I'm just going to raise my hand to switch the slides. So the work here does connect with Georges' presentation in that it was really spurred by the work of the collaborative. So Georges mentioned one of the working groups has to do with corrections, justice-involved individuals. So we got a grant from SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, to do some literature reviews related to the various working groups that the collaborative has put together so far. One of the groups we started, in fact, the group we started working with first, because it was the furthest along, was the corrections group. And so the three students mentioned there, Alex Schur, June Lee, and a little bit Emily Walsh toward the end, were really the people who found a lot of the articles. So I want to acknowledge them, as well as the leaders of that group, Anne Crocker, Laurence Roy, both professors, and Art Campbell, who's the director of social inclusion and reintegration at the YMCAs of Quebec. Next slide, please. So probably a lot of you know this already, but some of you may not. I didn't know this until I started looking at this literature. The way it works in Canada is if a judge gives somebody a sentence of 2 years or more, they go to a federal penitentiary. If they get a sentence of less than 2 years, they go to a provincial prison. Now, the federal penitentiary system has halfway houses, a system of halfway houses, such that there is quite a bit of accompaniment of people who leave federal penitentiaries. So the risk of homelessness is not that great. That's less of a concern. But in provincial prisons, certainly in Quebec provincial prisons, there is no systematic approach like that. So next slide, please. So there's a significant risk of homelessness, particularly for people who leave provincial prisons. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So how large a risk? Now, in the abstract that you may have read before choosing to come to this session, it's mentioned that we found 15%. At the time, that was the best figure we could find, but it was not very clear exactly what the ultimate source of it was. Since then, we found a meta-analysis, that is a synthesis of studies that actually report a number, a meta-analysis that concluded to an average rate across 5 studies that are from Canada, the US, Ireland, and Australia. That finds an average of 30% with a 95% confidence interval. That is an interval within which 95% of the time we expect the number to be, of about 16% to 46%. So a pretty wide range across studies. So, but still we get an average of 30%, which is quite a bit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So does that translate into a lot of people? Well, in Montreal, you see here a picture of the main provincial prison in Montreal. It's used to be called the Bordeaux prison. It's now called Établissement de détention de Montréal, which means like Montreal Detention Center. On any one day, there will be up to 1,402 men, it's a men's prison, who are either in remand, that is waiting to be tried, or serving sentences. But over the course of a year, 7,000 people will leave this prison typically. we don't have any actual data on how many of them become homeless. It just hasn't been studied. If it really is 30%, obviously that's a huge number. I tend to think it's probably not quite that many, or we'd see more homeless people in our point-in-time counts. But it's still quite a lot. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the research question that we asked was the kind of question that you have for a scoping review, which is, what do we know about policies or programs that prevent people leaving correctional facilities or correctional institutions from becoming homeless? Next slide, please. So we did an initial search process, which started with, I can't read the number here. So 3,415 papers that were then screened by 2 students, 2 of the people I named. And we ended up at that time with 14 papers. Next slide, please. But since then, additional articles have emerged. Once I started kind of reading the papers myself, I found others that hadn't been caught. And really, I think it needs to be said that the question in a scoping review is a little bit vague. So it's a little bit fuzzy to know, like, kind of what paper really contributes relevant information and what does not. So there's more fuzziness than around a meta-analysis where you're trying to get a particular number. So next slide, please. So, but before I start talking about those papers, I want to make a small detour and talk about something called critical time intervention. I wonder how many people here have heard of critical time intervention. Really not very many. Critical time intervention is a model for accompanying people usually from some kind of institutional setting into the community. It was first publicized in a paper that came out 25 years ago from Ezra Susser and others in New York City. And as you can see in the title of that first paper, they put critical time in quotation marks intervention after discharge from a shelter. So it was for people with mental illness in homeless shelters in New York City. How can we help them avoid homelessness? And it showed that it was actually pretty successful. Next slide, please. So the way critical time intervention works, it's a little bit like Housing First or assertive community treatment, which some of you probably have heard of. It's a standardized intervention. It's normally supposed to unfold over 9 months, excluding the very first phase of early engagement. And the basic idea is we accompany the person to resources in the community, and we try to make sure before we leave that the connections with those resources in the community are working well. So there are many studies that confirm its effectiveness in a variety of settings. You can, if you go to the Silberman School of Social Work in New York City, you'll find kind of resources to support the implementation of critical time intervention, a fidelity manual, and people who will train you for a fee to do it. So thank you. Next slide. So when we looked at the literature, we actually only found 3 articles that directly address the question, does this intervention we're trying out here, is it effective at reducing homelessness? Like, the intervention is designed to reduce homelessness among people who leave prison. So the 3 references are given here. Next slide, please. So I'll say a few words about each. So there's one by Lutz et al., 2014. So it's a re-entry housing program that was tried in Washington State. So it provides access to housing and wraparound services, so a form of case management, This study followed a good methodology. There were 208 people who entered the program. They were matched using a statistical technique called propensity score matching, which is a good statistical method. And basically what they found was that over 12 months post-release, 18.3% experienced an episode of homelessness compared to 26% in a comparison group. Next slide, please. So another study by Hignite and others in 2017 was done in Texas and Louisiana. It's for prisoners with mental illness and or substance abuse issues and who are at risk of homelessness. Again, a case manager accompanies the person in prison, plans services following release, and then has rapid housing referrals and social support services. So basically what they found was that out of 76 clients, 35 secured permanent housing, 25 disappeared, but there was no comparison group. So without a comparison group, it's really difficult to know how effective this actually was. Next slide, please. The third one is a study from the UK that came out recently. So same sort of idea. Most prisoners were engaged before release to build rapport, etc. They were supported for 12 weeks following release. Their transition was into the community was coordinated, helped them secure permanent housing, appeared to be successful. Those who engaged with the intervention were housed for, on average, 244 days out of in the first 9 months, so that's really most of the time. But they compared with the group who didn't engage with services, so obviously that's not very meaningful. So next slide, please. So if we sort of synthesize where we are so far, only one of those studies, the first one, suggests that there is some effectiveness to an intervention that tries to connect people with housing when they leave prison, and we find a reduction of about 1/3 in homelessness over 12 months. Next slide, please. So there have been many other interventions addressed to people leaving prison to address issues such as HIV, to connect them with care for their HIV, to address substance use of various kinds. Some are just on opioid use, for example, to address mental illness. Some studies are for people with severe mental illness, others with common disorders. We'll look at a couple of those in a moment. And others look at chronic health conditions. So in general, some effectiveness from these various studies. Next slide, please. So I want to focus right now a little bit, as announced in the abstract, on two of those studies that were particularly well done, that both come from England. The CRISP trial, I need to move fairly quickly. The CRISP trial, first of all, that in a nutshell, that was not effective in terms of helping people experience more housing. It was focused on helping people connect with mental health care at exit from prison for people with severe mental illness, but in terms of housing, it was not particularly effective. Next, please. So the Engager trial, the results of which just came out a few months ago, again, was kind of surprisingly unsuccessful and was not successful at improving housing outcomes. Next slide, please. So where does this leave us? Well, if there is no permanent housing to transition to, CTI doesn't appear to be very effective. So as long as there are good services to connect a person to, critical time intervention is appropriate and makes sense. But in the absence of kind of permanent housing, trying to connect the person to whatever services are out there is unlikely to be very effective. And Georges mentioned the Sortie Carcérale Planifiée program at the YMCAs of Quebec. We're trying to get funding to evaluate it with an enhancement that I'll come to in a moment, but it's not likely going to be terribly effective at helping people get housing and remain housed, because there just, as Georges was mentioning, there just isn't a lot of affordable permanent housing to connect to in Montreal. So there is, however, a study by Tehani et al. That looks at kind of data from the Veterans Administration system in the US, a retrospective study. Veterans in the US have access to a good supported housing with case management system. And there they find that kind of if you had a history of incarceration, doesn't really matter. The Housing First intervention works about as well to place you into housing and keep you over 12 months or so. So that suggests that Housing First is going to be our go-to intervention. Next slide, please. But there's one caveat to Housing First that I think kind of everybody should know in this room, and that is that so far what we found is that Housing First is not very effective at reducing reoffending. That was a finding from the At Home Chez Soi study. The Toronto group, who had an extra 4 years of follow-up, published last year a paper with the same finding. It's a student that I supervise and others published a literature review where we found the same thing. Housing First alone does not prevent reoffending, and that matters because reoffending leads to reincarceration, leads to housing instability. So we would like to be able to reduce reoffending as well. So this tells us that we need to do more than just Housing First. So we need a kind of Housing First plus for this population. So now what's going to be in the plus? Well, we do know that people who've been through the correction system almost universally have experienced trauma. Many have PTSD or complex trauma, like a succession of trauma events during their childhoods, during their adulthood. It's a very significant feature of people, many people who are homeless, of course, but it's, if anything, even more prevalent among people who've been through the correctional system. So obviously we want to have trauma-informed care, but trauma-informed care, while it may prevent re-traumatization, doesn't really address kind of the underlying consequences of having been traumatized or repeatedly traumatized. So what is the best plus? In an application that with the people from the corrections group I led and we submitted to CIHR, we're trying to see whether sortie carcérale planifiée, with its limitations as not having good Housing First attached to it because it just costs too much, unfortunately. We're testing out an intervention called Seeking Safety, which is a standardized, well-established intervention with modules to help people address the sequelae of their trauma. So we'll see whether that gets funded. That's a possible addition to put into the plus. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. So our conclusions. So first of all, we don't have any very good data on how many people leaving our provincial prisons experience homelessness, but we're pretty sure that it's a lot. So it's an important point to want to address to prevent homelessness. The evidence at this point suggests that if anything is going to work, it's going to be Housing First. But Housing First alone is going to be limited in its ability to prevent reoffending. So what we really need is Housing First plus. And at this point, the literature really doesn't tell us what should be in that plus, beyond obviously the Housing First needs to be delivered in a trauma-informed way. So next and final slide, please. So thank you for your attention.
What a great presentation, Eric. Let's move on to our final presentation of this session by Ahmed Bonaker. Ahmed holds a PhD in urban planning and public policy and is currently the managing director of research for Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Demonstration Lab. Prior to this role, Ahmed was a postdoctoral fellow at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. His research interests focus broadly on social equity, environmental justice, and community-based studies, in particular, the intersection of homelessness and housing. His recent research has been published in peer-reviewed journals including the International Journal of Cultural Cities, Public Works Management and Policy, and the Journal of Planning Literature. Off to you, Ahmed. In a second. So after this presentation, we are going to be having a question and answer period for all three of the presentations. So if you have any questions for any of the presentations, write them down and we can get to those after this, okay?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for waiting. I just had a bit of a problem because my PowerPoint presentation had a lot of animations, so it's really hard to navigate through these. So I had to make do to change it to a PDF format, which is more friendly. So great to be here. I'm Ahmed Monektar. I'm the Managing Director of Research. My colleague Emma introduced me. So I'm very happy to be here and thank you for your time. So in today's talk, I'll be discussing the findings of the 2019 National Youth Homelessness Survey with respect to the intersection between child protection services and youth experiencing homelessness. Because there is a whole lots of numbers and data, so I'm only going to present select findings. If you wanted to know more, please reach out and I'll be happy to share my slides with you. So next slide, please. Great. So with that, I just wanted to focus on youth homelessness in particular as a manifestation of social equity. And in fact, the state of homelessness in Canada found that young people experiencing homelessness accounted for 20% of the whole population of people experiencing homelessness. What it means in that literally on any given night, 6,000 to 7,000 young people experience homelessness, and this is a staggering number with huge implications for policymaking and program interventions. Next slide, please. So more recently, around 1,100 young people participated in the National Youth Homelessness Survey. The findings of the survey demonstrated that around 40% of those youth were younger than 16 years old when they first experienced homelessness. In addition, the survey found that 57%, more than 57% of those youth reported that they had been involved with some sort of child protection services or child welfare services at large. Next slide, please. So the question that remains is that what do we know about the nexus between child protection services and youth homelessness? And there is a large body of research that indicates that there exists a possible relationship between the early experience of youth with, and I'm going to use a shorthand here, CPS, and the subsequent risk of homelessness. And on top of that, subpopulations experiencing discrimination, including Indigenous youth as well as racialized youth, 2S LGBTQ plus youth, are overrepresented among those youth with a history of involvement with CPS. And generally, these youth are facing greater social equity barriers to accessing health services, education, and employment opportunities. Next slide, please. So one recent study that was published back in 2020 suggests that involvement with child protection services has had a negative impact on Indigenous populations in Canada in terms of increasing their risk of becoming homeless. This study also found that higher levels of education serves as a protection against homelessness for white people, but not necessarily for Indigenous populations, which also points to how Canadian education system is failing Indigenous populations. Next slide, please. Youth Pathways Project was yet another study that was conducted in Toronto, where 150 youth experiencing homelessness were interviewed regarding their experience with Child Protection Services, CPS. The study reported that 25%, as you can see, had been made the legal responsibility of the government, and 18% had been involved with Children's Aid Society, or CAS, at some point while growing up, while the majority did not report any involvement with CPS. Next slide, please. So having framed the study within the existing body of research and literature, so now I want to focus on the 2019 National Youth Homelessness Survey. The 2019 survey was a follow-up to the original 2016 survey, which was at that time the first pan-Canadian study of young people who experience homelessness. The 2019 survey was larger in sample size, as you can see, and was distributed to youth participants either electronically or on paper over a 4-month period, if I'm not mistaken, between January and April 2019. I was not really involved in designing that survey. Dr. Gates actually is here and could speak to that. 98 agencies were involved in conducting this survey across 49 communities, and more than 1,300 people participated in that survey. Next slide, please. So in this section, I'm going to focus on the findings. I start with providing like an overview of youth participants in terms of their demographic characteristics. Around 600 youth reported that they have a history of involvement with CPS, almost 61%, while around 40%, 39 to be more specific, did not report any involvement with CPS. Of those involved with CPS, though, as you can see, 21% reported foster care, 40% group homes, and 28% foster care and group homes. Next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of age, within the CPS group, the average age was around 20 years, with 36% self-identified as 2S LGBTQ+. In terms of gender identities, we had almost a similar proportion, as you can see, between women and men, with 11% identifying as gender diverse population. The majority of youth identified as white, with 11% as black and 25% as racialized. Within the CPS group, almost 35% reported that they have Indigenous backgrounds. Next slide, please. So in that survey, there was a section that asked specific questions about the experience of youth with child protection services. So for instance, youth were asked whether they received transitional support while they were in care, as you can see. 30% received help from a caseworker to help plan when leave foster care group home. And I think that this theme came up quite in George's presentation as well. I think this is what we want to focus on, thinking beyond the homelessness sector, because there is a potential relationship between child protection services and youth homelessness. 13% only reported that, only 13% reported that the risk of homelessness was assessed. And this is really disappointing, but this is important. And 35% received support in reconnecting with their family or a plan to kind of come up with a way to find a permanent placement with a relative. Next slide, please. Similarly, youth were also asked a set of questions whether they have received any of the support services after they left care. So 30% reported that they received support in terms of finding jobs, with 35% reporting that they received support to help them return to school. And I'm not, again, going through to every number that I have, but I'd be happy to share my slides with anyone who wants to know more. Next slide, please. Thanks. So it's interesting to know the difference in age of the first experience of homelessness in the CPS group compared to the non-CPS group. As can be seen, there was around almost 1.4 years gap between the average age of the first experience of homelessness between the CPS and non-CPS group. And existing literature has in fact looked at the intersection between indigeneity and involvement with child protection services. So the findings also demonstrated that, as you can see, the CPS involvement is more likely to be seen among the indigenous population, almost twice as likely. Next slide, please. So across a range of outcomes that the national survey has focused on here, there are some select findings that I'd like to focus on here and discuss them. So for example, in terms of quality of life, which is shown based on a scale from 1 to 5, with higher scores representing generally like a better quality of life. The score for CPS, as you can see, was a bit lower than that of the non-CPS group. And you might say this is like a very small margin, but nonetheless, in statistical parlance, this is significant. And the CPS group was also found to be more likely to be arrested or taken into custody by the police compared to the non-CPS group. And there are also more outcomes to be reported. Next slide, please. So for instance, I selected education, which I think is pretty much important in terms of contextualizing the research. So with respect to education, the analysis demonstrated that youth with CPS records are more likely to have reported lower educational attainment. I think I will not be going through every percentage here, but as you can see here, the CPS group were more likely to have higher school diploma compared to the non-CPS group, higher educational attainment for the non-CPS group. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to understand whether there is a potential relationship between child protection services and the age of the first experience of homelessness. So in statistics, usually you control for demographic characteristics, right, to hold them constant in order to be able to detect what's going on. So I controlled it for demographic characteristics to look at the relationship between CPS and the age of the first experience of homelessness. So if I wanted to put it simply, if two individuals almost similar in terms of age, racial diversity, and so forth, right? But they are different from one another in terms of their experience of involvement with CPS. How does their experience of CPS make a difference, right, in terms of experiencing homelessness? So the analysis showed that there is indeed a relationship, and youth with history of involvement with CPS might experience, well, this is like not causal relationship, it's association, but might experience homelessness at a lower age. Again, this might be due to a host of other reasons unknown to the researcher, but there is an indication that there might be some sort of association. Next slide, please. So in my last section, I just wanted to focus on what pretty much we can learn from all of this, and perhaps the better question is, what can we do to change policy to help these youth? I think we can start with transitional planning, and I think this has been like a important theme that was emerged during our conversation. The transitional planning for youth who are in care in particular given the fact that providing stable housing for these youth seemingly continues to be challenging. And so we need to have like a seamless transition for youth leaving care. And obviously it requires concerted efforts, right, across all levels of government to invest in service provision. And we need to have like a more efficient aftercare programs, right, with continued financial assistance to avoid any potential negative risks facing youth, including housing instability, homelessness, and low educational attainment. And while some of you may say this sounds like an obvious finding, but I think, you know, at policy level, some policymakers are resistant to pay attention. Next slide, please. So Indigenous youth were more likely to be at greater risk of involvement with CPS than their peers, and this is what our findings demonstrated at, which I think when we'll look at it more closely, we start to realize that their vulnerability to systemic and structural determinants, such as structural racism against them, leading to their homelessness. So we need to increase the level of awareness and what they really need, these youth, to develop culturally appropriate interventions that incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing. Next slide, please. Almost done, like a few more slides. And with youth involved with CPS experiencing low educational attainment, I think there should be more investment in school-based and upstream. I think that's what has been brought to our attention in terms of upstream intervention to identify barriers to accessing educational opportunities. And this should be a particular priority. Next slide, please. And as mentioned, the findings demonstrated greater risk of homelessness at an earlier age for youth in care. So there exist opportunities to engage policymakers in a fruitful conversation that prioritizes prevention. And preventive approaches have gained some traction, but I think there's a long way to make it like a common mainstream approach. Next slide, please. And I'll leave you with this quote extracted from What It Would Take, a report where youth have spoken about their experience of homelessness. I think we need to be cognizant of myth versus like facts, and where youth are deemed responsible for their problems and for their life. But it's quite the contrary. The burden is on the system, is on the onus is on researchers and policymakers to provide them with support services to lead an independent life. Next slide, please. I think I'm all done. Thank you so much. And thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Okay, come sit here. So it is now the question and answer period of the session. We have about half an hour for questions. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and you can go to one of the microphones to ask your question. And it's for any of the presentations. Yeah, at the back. You can go to one of the ones at the front here. There you go. Oh my God, you.
Thanks. Hi, thank you, all of you. My question is for the first presenter. The 5 working groups that you had, which were, there were like a variety of experts and stakeholders that were creating briefs. I was just wondering like who the experts were that you invited to be in the groups.
Well, I can address that too, actually. Well, our focus was Quebec, so we found academics mostly within McGill University, one at Université de Montréal, Anne Crocker, to be the academic co-chairs. And for the community sector, we just looked for people who were kind of very visible in the area. So for example, for the corrections group, it was Art Campbell, who's, as I mentioned, Director of Social Inclusion and Reintegration at the YMCAs of Quebec. For the gender and intimate, pardon me, and intimate partner violence group, it's Melpa Camateros, who's the director of the Shield of Athena shelter for women fleeing domestic violence. For the mental health group, we have a woman called Jessica Soto, who's the director of a community nonprofit called Diogène that offers housing first services for people with mental illness. So that was the basic system. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for any of our presenters?
Comment
Thanks. My name is Brian Marks, and I lead one of the 47 service managers in the province of Ontario with responsibility for homelessness. My question is to you, Professor Latimer, about actually two questions. Quick one. It's disheartening to hear about the lack of ability to translate work from incarceration to post-incarceration in support services, because we've spent a lot of time trying to convince our SolGen partners that this is a critical thing. I'm wondering if the study yielded any results, or if you have any comment on the case management methodology that's applied in an incarceration setting and the ability to translate that into community-based case management.
Well, I guess I would make two comments about that. One is that a general principle of care with case management is continuity is better. So if you can have the same individuals establishing rapport with the individual inside as will continue to follow the person outside, that would be preferable. And the second comment would be kind of clearly case management, especially if it's like strengths-based and so on, is better than not. But we need to be able to complement it with kind of actual access to affordable housing. So, and preferably affordable housing that corresponds to the person's preferences, which leads us toward a kind of scattered site housing model for most people. Not necessarily all, but many people.
Thank you.
I hope
And
that's
just one
helpful.
other quick question on,
Yes?
on the reincarceration. Did the study speak to the type of offense? Because I think largely I can speak from an Ontario context, Crown offices will report that the largest offense is typically bail violations, failure to appear. So if that's the case, that would also speak to a less than ideal level of case management and support for people who are released and then reoffend. So any comment on the nature of the reoffense?
Nothing beyond what you've said. Kind of, I would agree that well, case management in general is preferable, but as I was pointing out, what we were finding is that Housing First, which does include case management, doesn't appear to be particularly effective at reducing reoffending. So we need to do a bit more than that. I recently encountered a study coming out of the state of Georgia in the United States, where they use a sort of variant on case management, where one of the things that they try to do, this is for people with severe mental illness who tend to reoffend quite a lot, that's their population, is they try to focus on ensuring that everyone spends their days in a meaningful way. So to try to help people to have meaningful days. So, and that can be from just going to the gym and getting a good workout, can be from getting a job, it can be from any number of things, as long as the person finds it meaningful. And in that study, which is not yet published, I was a reviewer for it, so I can't say too much about it, but they reported a very large reduction in reoffending. So I wonder whether we don't need to perhaps use that approach, or anyway, I think we need to think some more about how to make the case management portion more effective in reducing reoffending. Thank you.
So the next question is from somebody online. This is from somebody named Riley. She asked, did any of the working groups include people with lived experience?
That's an excellent question. It's taken us some time to get that worked out. The corrections group has now set up a panel of service users with lived experience, but it's something we need to generalize to the other groups as well.
Any other questions from the room? She's going to go first, and then you can come in line to the door, and that's how people have kind of been doing it, that they walk up.
Yes.
Hi, Eric. It's nice to see you. I do have a question for you, but I'm feeling badly. It's a quick one, and then I have one for you, Ahmed.
Okay.
The question for you is about the something else. I love the way you concluded the talk. We need housing first. It's the go-to intervention to address housing and homelessness. And that's something that municipalities and a slew of community organizations are working on. My question is how to engage with Corrections Canada and the provincial corrections providers. Because right now, at least municipally where I live, they are not coming to the table. They don't see themselves as connected to the issue of homelessness. And we do have quite a recurring sort of cyclical pattern of people, no one's got the data on it, but just having talked to people who are experiencing homelessness in our community, a large number of them are just coming in and out of jail on repeat provincially, tiny, like minor offenses. How do we get them to the table to be part of the something else to prevent the reoffending?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I have a very good answer for you, unfortunately, because I am not Anne Crocker, Laurent or Art Campbell, who the co-chairs of the corrections group, who have been able to get people from the prison sector around the table with them to try to figure out how we can intervene at the various points where there's risk of people entering homelessness. So I don't have a very good answer, unfortunately.
Okay,
but it's
well,
nice to
keep
see
us
you in
posted.
person again.
Yeah, you too. And Ahmed, just quickly, it's great to see the study findings finally coming into the world. That's amazing. One of the, you said it was sort of a low impact conclusion. We need seamless organization of services. I feel like I have personally been saying that for like 10 years of my career. It strikes me that today, 10 years later, we also just have a serious lack of housing. So we can coordinate services till we're red in the face, but we don't have places that are safe and adequate for young people to live. They can't transition out of children's aid care into housing. There isn't housing. And even young people who are in care that are sometimes described colloquially as hard to house, they're getting harder to house because we have nowhere for them to be. And so, tell us something positive about the maybe Housing First for Youth pilot program that's targeting young people coming out of the care system, because we need something more than just do better coordination of services in this glaring systemic gap or lack.
Great, thank you. Well, I don't have an informed answer for you either, in terms of giving you some positive discussions or anything like that, for insufficient supply of affordable housing. I'm not a policymaker, but things are looking up in terms of providing affordable housing. I think with the government trying to kind of pivot their discourse around prevention, and provide more affordable housing. But speaking of Housing First for Youth, we've already started analyzing and looking at some of the data that we've been collecting for almost 4 years in Toronto and Ottawa. I think things are looking up in terms of our preliminary findings, and I believe that my colleague tomorrow will be presenting on some of our interim results of the first year 12-month results of Housing First for Youth. And for some of you that are not really familiar with Housing First for Youth, is an randomized controlled trial study that we've been doing in the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, looking at youth who are in the program receiving support services based on the principles that Dr. Gates developed for Housing First for Youth. And the other group is treatment as usual services. So we're trying to do like a comparison to see whether Housing First for Youth is an effective approach in terms of reducing homelessness functionally. So we are looking across a range of outcomes, including housing and stability, social integration, quality of life, and a lot of host of other factors, including like resiliency, food security, and so forth. So things are looking up, all I could say, and I'm hoping that we should be able to publish our results in a series of publications, including public-facing reports. So I'll stay in and stay tuned for tomorrow's presentation by my colleague. Yeah, thank you.
You can go ahead.
Sorry, it's not long enough.
Thank you. Short mic. Okay. Thank you very much. Wonderful presentations. You talked about Housing First Plus, meaning Housing First alone doesn't work. It needs to have the plus. And we're now 15, 17 years past the at-home chez soi. I was a part of that program in Manitoba, and particularly the ACT piece, the assertive community treatment. And we know from the publishing of that work that assertive community treatment with private market rent providers worked. It was effective, and it was in fact Housing Plus, or Housing First Plus. I guess, can you comment on 17 years later why, although that's been published and clearly indicated that it was economically viable, that it worked, that we're still talking about Housing First Plus as some mystery that doesn't exist?
Sure. I'm happy to address that. Thank you. I'm not saying that Housing First does not work for people who come out of corrections. I guess I wasn't as clear as I could have been. I mean, it does work, and in fact, the study by Tehani, Rosenheck, and others that I mentioned briefly, looking retrospectively at veterans in the United States, I forget what the number was, it was like 14,000 some veterans who had been through the Housing and Urban Development VASH program, VA-supported housing program, that combines housing vouchers with case management, basically, found that it worked about equally well for people who had been through incarcerations as people who had not. So if somebody has a history of incarcerations, we can house them with Housing First. The point I was trying to make is that it would be nice if we could do better still, because we're not preventing reoffending. And reoffending leads to re-incarceration, which obviously impairs housing stability. So the plus I'm referring to is not saying Housing First doesn't work. It's for this population, can we find a way of making it work even better so that we reduce reoffending? And that's where I was saying, I don't think we quite know the answer yet as to what we can do more to effectively prevent reoffending. Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay.
So I was actually agreeing with you.
Okay.
And I guess my point is, I can only speak for the Manitoba study, but the Manitoba study demonstrated that when you have assertive community treatment and you involve private market rent providers who are protected in the event that their properties are damaged, with people coming out of prison system, particularly the Manitoba prison system, into assertive program with housing, that worked. It was effective. And then when we looked at the cost of that versus the control group that had no supports, well, it saved money. So it was on par or it saved money. It was expensive, but the point is if you looked at the cost of system use, it saved money. That was our finding in Manitoba.
I'll comment on that.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, my point is, this many years later, we still have an ACT program or assertive community treatment. We have these, but it's been decoupled. It's not tied in with the housing. So that's over here, right?
Yeah.
So looking forward, if we did a critique of the at-home chez soi study, which was a wonderful study, 15 years later, and what happened with it, why have policymakers allowed that to happen? Why did we not take what we learned from that study that's now 15, 17 years old and put in place processes that would see it move forward in terms of the outputs that were productive and positive?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, it makes sense. All right, I'm going to say two things. The first thing is I want to comment on what you said about the economic impacts. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was the lead economist for the at-home chez soi study. I've looked at the economics of this and published the results from the at-home chez soi on the economic findings. And the news is not as positive as is commonly said in the media. We did not find that we saved money with Housing First. What we found is that we recouped roughly half of the cost of the intervention, whether it was for the high-need group, which was more expensive intervention, or the moderate-need group. Roughly half of the cost we recouped in reduced use of shelters and other services. It's important to note that this is a bit dependent on what was the population that we followed. In the at-home chez soi study, we decided we were not going to target high-cost users, as is often done in the US. In the US, there's more of a philosophy of, well, people who are homeless by their own fault. So if we're going to do an intervention, it at least has got to save us some money, and the best way we can save money is by targeting high-cost users. That was not the philosophy of the at-home chez soi project. And there were a number of people, if you look at the data in detail, you see there were a number of people who were recruited from under bridges and so on, who were staying away from services, who were not costing the system very much at all. And so there was no way we were going to save money by giving them more services. And in fact, in some cases, we discovered, let's say I remember one case, the team discovered, oh, gee, you have hepatitis B. We should treat you for that. So that person went through, at the time, 2 cycles of interferon B therapy before they were finally cleared of their hepatitis, sorry, not B, C. And so that, obviously, that person cost more money than they would have otherwise. But that was good. So I think we have to recast the whole economic thinking around Housing First to saying, yes, it does cost a bit more money, at least in a short run. Maybe in a long run, it saves money, but nobody knows that for sure yet. But, gee, we spend money on hip replacements on 70-year-olds quite happily, and we know that's not going to save society any money whatsoever. It's going to improve the quality of life of that person, and that's good enough for us to spend money on doing it. So why would we not do the same thing for a person who's homeless and has really a miserable existence? That as a rich society like ours, we can do better than that. So that's on the a comment, if you'll allow me, on what you said about the economics. Now, I'm sorry, I just got carried away and I forgot your second point. Can you briefly remind me?
It's just that we looked at sort of 15 years later why we could.
Yes, why we're not doing it more broadly. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, good question. And I'm pretty familiar with the politics surrounding that within the province I come from, which is Quebec. Really not familiar with what's going on in the other provinces, I have to admit. what I observe in our context is that, well, certainly in Quebec, there's been a certain amount of grassroots opposition to the Housing First model, a concern that the money is going to go to Housing First programs instead of supporting existing community organizations that are doing things like day centers and so on, that are really just putting a Band-Aid, which kind of better than nothing, but it's not moving people into permanent housing. So there hasn't been unanimity, at least in Quebec. I don't know about other provinces, but even at the grassroots level, there hasn't been unanimity in support for that approach. But I think the other factor is just that, unfortunately, it costs money to implement it. And it costs more and more money as rents are going up and up. In the province of Quebec right now, the standard rent supplement is $650 a month. The rent of a one-bedroom apartment on the market right now, I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly, but it's substantially above $1,000 a month. So kind of $650 is just not going to get you very much. So we can't do Housing First properly because there's not very many apartment buildings and landlords that will provide kind of degraded enough housing that we can the person can actually pay for the balance of the rent out of their meager social assistance income. So we need to really increase social the financial help to pay the rent. And actually, there's a project that Nick Falvo over there at the end is heading up that we're doing for the province of Quebec to figure out like what would be the best mechanisms to provide rental assistance so that people at the bottom end of the income distribution can actually afford a decent place to live. So I think that's it. It's just there's not enough political pressure to say, kind of, we need to house people who are homeless. I think we need to change the minds of the Canadian population so that politicians feel the pressure to allocate the dollars to solve this problem. That's a big part of it. Anyway, thank you.
Can I weigh in just
Yes,
on the latter point you just raised regarding political pressure? And well, I think, there is a long-standing tradition of looking or bringing a public health model into equation in terms of we all start by framing and defining the problem and then identifying the root causes of a particular problem, in this case, homelessness, and a public health approach mandates that, okay, you go and identify potential solutions. But there is a fourth step that is pretty much ignored, at the policy level, which is a widespread adoption of an effective strategy, right? I think this has not been like a priority at the policy level. And what Eric just said makes a lot of sense, especially at the policy level. We need to, kind of be more resistant. We need to kind of convene these conferences in order to amplify our voices and kind of do our own work. Because to me, it sounds like even though these studies have partially been successful in terms of raising the level of awareness, but I think it takes a lot more because all of our monies, not all of our monies, the majority of the monies are being channeled into emergency services, right? Ad hoc services, which is an important part of every strategy in order to be able to tackle homelessness. But I think it's not simply enough. So this is just what I wanted. And policies are resistant to change. Sometimes it takes 10 to 15 years, maybe more than that, to take effect. So this is just wanted to bring attention to. Thank you.
We have time for one more question today.
I'm very nervous now that I'm holding the microphone. Just wanted to say thank you so much for that presentation. That was what I needed to kind of get excited for the rest of the 3 days. The plus comment again, and then the youth study as well. So I actually, so in my rural community, I decided to take a multi-sectoral approach with my community. So when I get you, and prevention. So, sorry, I have to context this for a second. So when a youth comes to my door, it's prevention. They get a CAS worker, myself in community health, youth justice, and mental health. And we sort of converge rapidly around the youth, not to be confused with crisis. So as a social worker, one of the things that I don't want to do for the rest of my life is put out fires every single day. It's not a way to live. It's not a way to work. It doesn't work. It's just tiring. So some of the questions that I've had throughout the past 4 years of this program I've been running is, and it's funny you said +1 because I created this complex name for it and I really just wanted to call it +1 program. But everybody's plus looks different, but the system is fundamentally one size fits all. How do you actually work? And it's predicated on discharging constantly. It's like problem out, goodbye. Come back when problem's back, problem out, goodbye. How do we switch from outcomes to sustainability? What conditions does a person need to grow in their community? Not where can I send them? What do we do with them? How do we stop this or that? Some of the youth that, so how do we contextually get to live with the problem case by case long enough to actually sustain a change in a way that everybody is in line, I guess? How do we, I've always thought, how do you remove all the hoops without waiting for policy or for waiting for frontline to change? It just, I don't know what my question is per se. It's more of like a, but it's this politics of prevention piece that I find so tiring because with the right conditions and the right combination of people around a youth, they don't even go to prison. I've got kids that have never these are unservable kids, but they've been living on their own for 2 years with complete supports. How did we do that? How do we offer better than what the traffickers are offering, right? That's sort of like how do we switch to sustainability versus we saw this outcome. It's, no, I don't need to see this kid again because they're fine. Do you know what I mean? Sorry, it's a question, non-question, but I feel like that's where it sits every day for me. And at the same time, I have to say, I was rehousing kids under this model sometimes within 24 hours. For meeting them, without housing, that's impossible. I've been chasing housing for 6 months for some kids now, right? So anyway, I just want to kind of leave that blurb out there, but it's been an interesting 4 years, and thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles, you haven't had a chance to say very much. Do you want to address this point?
So I go through the same experience in many ways as a prevention director for a mission. So I tend to meet a lot of reasons why they become homeless, but I guess I get more often than not closed doors, or on the contrary, when I get the door open, it's more inquisitive. So they don't see the relationship, they don't want to see it. So it takes me a lot of time to be able to bridge the gap, to be able to meet individuals and say, would you like to work on a pilot project? It won't cost you anything. It'll be cute. And we'll be eventually working together to resolve the issue of homelessness. So I think a lot of ways that I've approached it is to be able to be sensitive to their difficulties in terms of the institutional constraints that they have, and to be able to say, here's an option for you to be able to grow in terms of doing something differently. So it's worked because I offer something that is cute, cuddly, that doesn't spend a lot of money, and that we work with what we have to be able to make the point. On the other spectrum is the QHPPC, which I do work with on a board, but I don't have the impact that they have. So I work more on the ground, but I have to take into consideration policy at the same time. So to answer your question, it's this silver lining that you say in English, where I'm able to have these conversations and try to bring them towards pilot projects or demonstration projects over the course of the year, and then to be able to relay that information and say, so there's hit, miss, but we're growing together. And I've had success over the course of the last year, meaning that they're willing to bite the bullet, to be in the shadows, and to grow differently than they've grown over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. And I think this is, it gives hope. For me, on a personal level, I've been working in homelessness for, I would say, close to 20 years. And one of the issues is exactly what you said in terms of working crisis. So I am not that old, but I have a lot of gray hair. But I also have 6 kids, so you have to decide whether you have to decide which is the reason of the white hair. But when I moved into prevention, I was able to have a conversation with myself and be able to write something down, to be able to come back to it eventually. In crisis, you don't have that. You're always in an emergency mode, and you're always like, the week is over, let's wait to see what happens week number 2, week number 3. By being able to work in prevention, I am forced to be able to address issues that are, so one of my recommendations is for you to be able to move away as much as possible for the day-to-day, and to be able to get a sense of, can we have a conversation, which is seldom happens when we are in crisis.
Thank you again to all the presenters in the session and to all of you for joining us today. And another big thank you goes out to the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, who was the sponsor for this session. We do have a table downstairs, so if you would like to learn more about what we do as an organization and our kind of smaller organizations that we manage, we are happy to talk to you, and we're excited to learn how we can help you out. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.